government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back into another podcast by George. Well, we're going to be talking Afghanistan today with our old buddy, our old pal, Matthew Hoh. And if folks haven't seen him on the show before, he's great. He's got nearly 12 years experience with America's wars overseas with the United States Marine Corps, Department of Defense and State Department. He's been a senior fellow with the Center for International Policy since 2010. In 2009, Matthew resigned with the State Department over the American escalation of the war. Prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, Matthew took part in the American occupation of Iraq, first in 2004-05 in Salah Abdin province with a State Department reconstruction and governance team, and then in 2006-07 in Anbar province as a Marine Corps company commander. When not deployed, Matthew worked on Afghanistan and Iraq war policy and operations issues at the Pentagon and State Department from 2002-2008. So let's welcome him on in. Matt, welcome back to Podcast by George.
Hi, George. Thanks for having me here.
I should bear with us here just a little bit. I'm going to read this and try to get through it here very quickly on my makeshift teleprompter here, see if I can get this read. In January 1973, representatives of the United States, North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed a peace agreement in Paris, ending the direct U.S. military involvement in the Vietnam War. Its key provisions included a ceasefire throughout Vietnam, the withdrawal of U.S. forces, the release of prisoners of war, and the reunification of North and South Vietnam through peaceful means. The South Vietnamese government was to remain in place until new elections were held, and North Vietnamese forces in the South were not to advance further nor be reinforced. In reality, however, the agreement was little more than a face-saving gesture by the U.S. government. Even before the last American troops departed on March 29th, the communists violated the ceasefire, and by early 1974, folks, full-scale war had resumed. At the end of 1974, South Vietnamese authorities reported that 80,000 of their soldiers and civilians had been killed in fighting during the year, making it the most costly of the Vietnam War. 1974. On April 30th, 1975, the last few Americans still in South Vietnam were airlifted out of the country as Saigon fell to the communist forces, and we had Jerry Berry from the Marine Corps on the podcast. He was flying one of those choppers that got those people out. North Vietnamese Colonel Bui Tin, accepting the surrender of South Vietnam later in the day, remarked, and this is prophetic, this is the guy from North Vietnam, he said, "You have nothing to fear." He's talking to his countrymen here. He said, "Between Vietnamese, there are no victors and no vanquished. Only the Americans have been defeated." Now, folks know the Vietnam War was the longest and most unpopular foreign war in U.S. history and cost 58,000 American lives. 2 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were killed. That article came from the History Channel. And, you know, Matt, that just kind of goes by and you read that. And the thing that I always have to stop and think about is that civilian casualty count. That's something we don't know anything about. We talk about wars here in this country, but 2 million soldiers and civilians killed in Vietnam. That Iraq war put as many as 1 million civilians in the ground. And of course, Afghanistan has its own body count for both military and civilian.
Yeah, the Afghans are. I just heard an Afghan speak to this recently, and her suggestion was 1 million dead Afghans in the last 20 years. Of course, you got to realize the Afghan war really begins in the 1970s, late 1970s. This is a living legacy of the Cold War, and millions of Afghans have been killed, millions, killed, maimed. The Afghans are the largest refugee population in the world. Millions live in Pakistan, millions live in Iran, millions are internally displaced. The wreckage of this war. But like you said, you look at the Vietnam War, at least 2 million dead. I mean, a lot of times I see the figures of 3 to 4 million, and that doesn't include Cambodia and Laos, right? You know, and you had with the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot, you know, a quarter of the population there died, you know, I mean, and that was a direct result of the United States' actions. I mean, it's just the horror of it. But I went to high school with a kid who came from, who was a refugee from Vietnam. Him and his sister were put on a boat by their family when they were, you know, babies, basically. And they somehow made it to New Jersey. And I remember when I was a senior in high school, then we were, you know, Tam and I we ate lunch together every day, and he was reunited with his family. And that was about 1990 or 1991, that would have been, you know, I mean, so the impact that these wars have, you know, they don't stop. The war didn't stop when the U.S. left Vietnam. It didn't stop when Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese. I mean, it lasts for decades and decades because people are living with the consequences of it. And, you know, certainly with these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, you know, the consequences, even if we were to wave a magic wand and the Islamic State was to disappear and everybody was to drop their weapons and get along, people are still going to be dealing with the consequences, the fallout, the tragedy of these wars for the rest of their lives. And it will extend then through other generations because, you know, you're still having thousands and thousands of children every year are still born in Vietnamese hospitals who are suffering from Agent Orange deformities, you know, crippling illnesses, being stillborn, etc. So these things don't end.
What about the irony here between the Vietnam War and the situation in Afghanistan as an example? I mean, it's analogous. I mean, what happened there, what has happened in Afghanistan, and probably what's about to happen.
Yeah, it's you know, it just goes to the old adage. I mean, that you know, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. You know, there is a continuous line that runs through American history, particularly American foreign policy. And that foreign policy, of course, begins when we're still the 13 colonies, you know, because, you know, one of the things that people are upset about the 1619 project, about the series put together by the New York Times a couple of years ago about the founding of the United States and the implication of long-term racism and systemic racism. But, you know, I mean, in the years before the American Revolution, the King of England says you can't expand farther westward. And that is a major grievance of those who rebel against, you know, their British masters, basically, is this inability to continue to expand west. So you've always had an expansionist American foreign policy, and that line continues, you know, all the way to now. And so I think it's you know, to look at American history not as as in terms of separated, isolated events in the vacuum, events that are maybe connected but not really. No, the thinking that occurs here, the people who took over and who waged these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they learned from the people who waged the war in Vietnam. I mean, they come from that same class of people. They come from the same schools. These men and women were in junior positions when those who were waging the Vietnam War were still in power. There's a continuity here that people need to understand. We cannot look at these things as you know, the Vietnam War starting on this day and ending on this day, the Iraq War starting on this day. No, there is a continuity to all this that just blows through any attempt to circumscribe or delineate or define start and end dates.
Well, Rumsfeld is one of those guys, right? I mean,
exactly. That's exactly right. Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense in the Ford administration right after the Vietnam War ended. I mean, like he was Secretary of Defense when Saigon was falling. Right. I think he was. Maybe I'm not exactly sure about that date.
I think that's right.
He was, right. I mean, like, so that's exactly what we're talking about here. You know?
And Kissinger doesn't need to reach out from the grave. He's still alive, isn't he?
He's still alive. Yeah. He's still alive. And he's celebrated. And
Yes.
he is the grand old man of American diplomacy, that war criminal, right? I mean, that tells you a lot about that. I mean, I give you the one time I actually spoke with Rumsfeld. I was a captain in the Marine Corps stationed in the Pentagon in from 2000 to 2002, and I was around Rumsfeld a few times, but I only spoke with him once. And like a lot of these people, he was incredibly charming in person, particularly to people that he didn't want anything from or wasn't demanding anything from. And myself and my friend, she was a Navy officer. She was a lieutenant in the Navy. So same thing as me, a junior officer. And we're standing there and Rumsfeld comes over to us and he says, we're standing in front of this portrait of Eisenhower. And Rumsfeld says, you know how old I am? I knew that guy. That's how old I am. But it shows that, right? I mean, like he actually worked with Eisenhower, right? And Eisenhower, of course, have worked with, Eisenhower's history goes back to before the First World War, right? In terms of being a general in the army and everything, on and on and on. I mean, It just, right? And so who was Eisenhower familiar with? Eisenhower was familiar with guys that had fought in the Civil War.
Yeah.
I mean, right? I mean, so history is not that far removed from us. And so we have to look at the people and who they come from, who are their ancestors, so to speak. And that's how we keep doing this, George. This is why this situation, big shock. We've got all these people in Afghanistan that we are, hanging out to dry. Oh, geez, didn't we do that in Vietnam? Sure did. Didn't we do that in Iraq? Sure did. So.
That segues very nicely. You've kind of led us to where we're going here. I wanted to bring this article up on screen, and it was the reason that I reached out to Matt, because, again, this is something that I know he has firsthand knowledge about, and it is something, as he mentioned, that was a big issue with Vietnam, and it did not end well for a lot of our friends over there that could not get out, obviously. I mean, there's blood on someone's hands with that, but let's bring this article up. This is making a lot of news in the heartland. It's a personal story, but that's okay because it gets a bigger look at the bigger picture through a personal lens. I like that. The headline is Joni Ernst, Chuck Grassley say they can't do anything to help Afghan interpreters' asylum case at this point. U.S. Senator Joni Ernst said Wednesday that her office has done everything it can to help an Afghan interpreter living in Iowa Falls, but his request for asylum is now in the hands of the U.S. State Department. Our office has been involved, as well as Senator Grassley's, and at this point we have done everything that we can from Congress's side with that case, she said Wednesday. It's in the State Department's hands right now, and it would be up to the administration on how it's handled. Well, okay, I like to almost look at every word in these things. Let's jump out there very quickly, and we'll come back to it, Matt. But it seems to me like there's always this trapdoor that these Congress people want to jump through when something comes up that's difficult. Is what she's saying, is that accurate? I mean, are they really powerless at this point?
No, George, they control the money. You kidding me? This is the same thing I got from our, different situation, but analogous, right? Last year, after George Floyd, and we had protests here in North Carolina, and the Wake County Sheriff's Department handled them very brutally, right? No need for the level of force that they used. They were just randomly shooting people with those pellet guns and other things. And I sent a letter to my county board of commissioners, and I said, "What are you guys doing about this?" And the response I got back from the vice chair of the county was that nothing we can do. Then a week later, they all voted to give the sheriff's department $100 million, right? You know what I mean? Come on. That's you give the State Department's budgets like $50 billion a year or something like that. These are the people that control that budget. You want to make them do something, you just tell them to do it, or else you're not getting your money. And particularly if you have almost unanimous consent within the House and the Senate. If Ernst and Grassley were to stand up and say, "Hey, look, the State Department is not getting any money until they take care of these people," all 535 people in that House and Senate would support that. That's an easy thing to do. This is a personal thing for me. I was in Iraq twice before I went to Afghanistan. And when I went to Afghanistan, I made a pledge to myself I wasn't going to make any Afghan friends, because I had made Iraqi friends and a lot of them were killed, and I knew more were going to be killed, and they were killed, and they And there are people I can't get in contact with anymore in Iraq. I have no idea what happened to them, let alone if they are alive, the hell that they have been through these last, decades. So that was my experience in the sense going to Afghanistan. I'm not making friends with anybody because I can't do this to myself. Very selfish, of course, but I can't do this to myself. Like because I know what is going to happen to these people because this is what we do. Yes. This is what we've done. This is what we do. And so this idea that they can't do anything now they can just hold that the budget like a gun to the head of the State Department and say, do this.
Well, this particular article for me, I kind sometimes in the news, I look at it and I feel like I'm stumbling around in a house of mirrors. And man, there were a lot of mirrors in this article. So let me bring this up a little bit and we'll get to that part of it. The article continues and it talks about this fellow known as Z. He worked as a translator for U.S. Armed Forces in Afghanistan for years. And these are the types of folks that Matt was working with too. They're critical. I mean, you've got to have them. Now, he was denied. Get this. This guy was accused of having engaged in terrorist activity, which his lawyer believes is due to Niazi's decision to give bread to Taliban fighters who threatened his family when he was 9. Speaking to reporters Wednesday, Grassley and Niazi will have to go through the hearing process for his removal proceedings. Until he has a hearing on his deportation, there isn't anything that he can do or anything else anybody can do because he's going to have to go through that process, they said. And of course, then the politics comes into it. On a call with reporters Wednesday, Ernst, a Republican, as we know, also criticized the U.S. military's withdrawal from Afghanistan, saying she's concerned that Afghan interpreters and civilians who aided the United States will be put at risk. President Joe Biden, a Democrat, has said the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan will conclude by August 31st. And it's boots on the ground that he's talking about there. And whose boots they are, that's another issue. We can talk about that. He said in remarks at the White House that his military commanders advised him to move swiftly once the drawdown began, saying speed is safety. Well, again, just to go back to the earlier conversation that we had, the history is in the books. Vietnam is an excellent blueprint for this. Ernst and her ilk not only supported the Afghanistan military operation, but they voted repeatedly to continue to fund it and extend it. And now they stand back wringing their hands saying, oh my God, what are we going to do with these people? That's the insult. And then the injury is they're kind of intimating that maybe after 20 years, my God, as the great Jimmy Dores said, the Afghanistan war finally earned its gold watch. Are you intimating that we should continue over there for any period of time at all to protect these people or for any reason? And of course, the reason they need protection is because of the invasion.
Whenever I hear about this, we need more time. I always want to look up what massive projects within human history have taken more than 20 years. How long did it take them to build the pyramids? Yeah. Kind of thing. It's just, it's maddening that, I'm not sure which is correct in the sense of Ernst, some of the things she says. Is she lying or is she ignorant? And then and if she's ignorant, is she willful ignorant?
Is she too dumb or is she in on it? That's what I always, it's that line out of the movie Casino that I bring up all the time with Robert De Niro. I might show that clip. Every time I do, I get in trouble with copyright, of course, with YouTube. But I mean, my God, it's a perfect example of what we're talking about. You're either too dumb or you're in on it. And in any regard, you can't work here. I mean, that's a lose-lose. That's the way I put it. That was the way De Niro told his slot manager in the casino. But you can't have either one of those things in a casino, and you can't have them in a theater of war.
Yeah, with what Ernst is saying there, with the translators, these translators have been in trouble for years now. This has been something that veterans groups, human rights advocates, refugee advocates, et cetera, have been jumping up and down about for years. I mean, for at least 5 years, probably even more, probably when Obama really started to bring troops back in 2013, 2014 from Afghanistan. This has been a major issue for particularly veterans groups for the last 7 or 8 years now. So for Ernst to say that it's because Biden pulled the last 2,500 troops out of Afghanistan, that all of a sudden this is happening, especially when those troops haven't left their bases in 3 or 4 years, basically. The Taliban haven't killed an American in more than 18 months. And that's because, one, the Taliban haven't been trying to do it because they're trying to do everything they can to make sure the United States leaves. So they know if we kill an American, that gives the United States an excuse to stay. But the other part, too, is that the American forces just haven't been going outside as much as they used to. Yeah, some commandos still do, and some other people on whatever missions do. But for the most part, it's not like it was 7, 8, 9 years ago when we had constant presence on the roads and on patrols and stuff. So, but this inability to protect them is something, again, that has been a major issue. And so for Ernst to say now it is because Biden's doing this. And the other thing I want to bring up, that because you mentioned it, that you read it in the article, is remember the reason why Joe Biden said he couldn't pull the troops out of Afghanistan by May 1st when he made that decision back in March or April, was because we couldn't do it fast enough.
Yeah.
Because he was told by the military that it could not happen quickly. This would be a long process. And now all of a sudden we pulled them out because swiftness is safety, right? We got it done in 2 months, basically. Again, so the lying that occurs in all of this. And then the other aspect that people, and I think I may have said this to you before, George, but people really need to think about is that why, if the commander in chief had directed that under President Trump, had directed that the military be out by May 1st, how come the military wasn't prepared to do that? We have a very serious problem with a civilian authority in government right these days. I mean, you saw that the military was lying to President Trump, who, of course, I got to do the caveat. He's a terrible president, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. But, we have a system. And when the United States military is lying about the number of troops it has in Syria or Iraq to the president of the United States to get its way, that is a very serious issue. But to get back to this issue of the translators and everything, they've now said that the translators will be, they will begin to remove them and their families. They're estimating maybe as many as 70,000 people beginning the last week of July. That there's no reason why that couldn't have occurred before. Why, and there's all kinds of problems with doing that now because it's so late to do it and everything. But, it's just an issue of will. It's just an issue of priority. It's just, and for the members of Congress like Joni Ernst or Chuck Grassley, it's an issue of using these people's lives for their own political gains, to be able to make their claims against the Democrats or whatever.
Yeah, it's 20 years. They're all involved, and particularly the gray beards like Grassley and Joe Biden. Don't forget about that. Now, he's going to get credit, and they are going to draw down these troops, and some of these military operations are going to cease in Afghanistan. Biden will get credit for that, but he was actively involved on the Democratic side of the aisle in keeping this thing going for many years, and, of course, with the Obama administration also. So I want to make that mention. And again, I'm looking at my clock.
Biden was actively involved in getting the Vietnamese refugees out of Vietnam. This is the whole continuity of this, right? He was actively involved in the discussions in 1975 about that, right? I mean, and there are he comes across in mixed ways. He at one point he says it's something like not a dime will go to those Vietnamese, and at other points he's saying no, we've got to do this. So he comes across very mixed, I think. But yeah, no, that's like we were talking about before. There's a continuity here, George. That none of this is new.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was just having this conversation, completely different topic, but I like to make this point to people. John Wayne. I mean, probably the biggest non-fighter military hero in the history of the country. John Wayne knew Wyatt Earp personally. I mean, that's the lineage that we're talking about, like
Yeah.
Matt's talking about. Wyatt Earp was an old man retiring in California. He'd lived that long. He was in his 80s, I don't know, maybe approaching 90 years old. He was hanging around the Hollywood movie sets when Marion Morrison, John Wayne, was just a runner on a movie set, and he got to befriend him, taking him coffee and stuff, and actually had conversations with John Wayne or with
Yeah.
Wyatt Earp. But to Matt's point, he took on some of the mannerisms and characteristics of Wyatt Earp and formed his persona on screen, his acting because of Wyatt Earp. So, God, that's unrelated, but it's the same kind of thing. Well, we're out of time. Sometime I'm going to do a bonus edition of Podcast by George. It's going to be 2 hours in length, and we're going to have Matt Hoh on it. Before we wrapped up and got out of here, Matt, I want to give you a closing comment here, but I also want you to maybe point people towards some writings that you've had about this drone situation now that's going to be very important all over the Middle East, of course, but particularly in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the drones are look, people have been issuing warnings about the drones for 20, 30 years now. I mean, in terms of this futurized concept of war where it's going to be automated, human hands, human minds are not going to be as involved. And that's coming to fruition. I mean, you've had last year a drone in Libya operated independently, autonomously, went out and found its own person to kill and killed them. I mean, that's the technology that exists, not in the future, but today. And the advances that continue every year. And so, yeah, I have an essay in Counterpunch about it, this week. But then also too, most of my writing is in Counterpunch. I had something in CNN. But if you just Google my name, Matthew Hoh, last name spelled H-O-H, you'll find whatever I've written. Yeah, it is. It's a lot of these problems that we have, George, are not just appearing unexpectedly. Whether it be climate change, whether it be the drones, whether it be this refugee crisis with these translators. What are we going to do with these 70,000 people? They're people who worked for us, who now, rightly or wrongly, many people in Afghanistan see them as collaborators with the occupiers, right? I mean, like, that's the reason why they're in danger, is they're viewed that way, again, rightly or wrongly. And but we have a moral obligation to them. And, this was something that, like you said, we've said, has happened before in our history, and was something that was readily apparent. Like I said, the groups have been jumping up and down about this for 7 or 8 years now. And so for people, and it's the same thing too, what we see with climate change, what we'll see when the drones and this automized, and computerized weaponry, these robots basically start showing up in our society.
Yes.
People are going to act like, oh my God, how did this happen? Where did this come from? And people have been, saying this, but the problem is we have a political system that it's captured by the demands of money and special interests. And right now, all the money is behind the drone manufacturers and the weapons manufacturers. So Congress isn't going to do anything about that. Yeah.
God, I love having this guy on the show. I'm serious. We're going to do a 2-hour episode sometime. It'll take me all day to upload it to YouTube, but I'll point people towards it, and we'll be able to talk. We just get to riffing. It's like a jam session or something. It's just great. Matthew Hoh, thanks once again, for coming on a Podcast by George.
Thank you, George.
We'll get him back. We'll get him back very soon, folks. And we'll talk more at length about this and other issues top of mind with Matthew Hoh. But I hope you like Podcast by George. And if you do, as I always close the show, encouraging people to like us on YouTube in particular, trying to grow that community there. Subscribe, ring that notification bell, subscribe to us on iTunes. You can follow us on Spotify, the iHeartRadio app. And of course, we're always on Facebook, easily found there at the home of Podcast by George, and also a lot of political groups that repurpose the podcast. But that's going to do it for this particular episode. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.